The sound of 30 people suddenly going quiet is something you never forget. One moment, Uncle Dave was telling his fishing story for the 100th time, cousins were arguing over the last piece of cornbread, and kids were screaming as they ran through the sprinklers on the back lawn. The next moment, complete silence. All because my sister Jessica decided that our annual Thompson family reunion was the perfect stage to announce to everyone exactly what she thought of my life choices. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Seriously, Alex, she said, her voice carrying across the entire backyard like she was addressing a courtroom. You're 28 years old, still living in that tiny apartment, bouncing between odd jobs, and now you want to quit your steady income to chase some pipe dream. Face it, you're the family disappointment. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it wasn't kind either. It was the nervous, uncomfortable laughter of people who didn't know how to respond when someone says out loud what they've all been thinking. My face burned as I stood there holding a paper plate of potato salad, watching my own family nod in agreement with Jessica's brutal assessment of my worth. But what happened next changed everything. Not just for me, but for how I understood family loyalty and what it really means to prove someone wrong. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about the moment I stopped trying to fit into a box that was never meant for me and started building something that was. I'm Alex Thompson, and until that sweltering August afternoon in my parents' backyard in Riverside, Ohio, I'd spent most of my adult life apologizing for who I was. Not directly, of course. The Thompsons don't do direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary. We do it through subtle disappointment, raised eyebrows, and conversations that start with, well, at least you're happy, delivered in a tone that suggests happiness might not be worth much. My sister Jessica had always been the golden standard in our family, valedictorian at Riverside High, full scholarship to Ohio State, law degree, partnership track at a prestigious firm in Columbus, married to another lawyer, house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and a 10-year plan that she'd not only written down but laminated. She was everything my parents had dreamed of when they first held their baby daughter 26 years ago. I was the question mark, the we're not sure what Alex is doing conversation topic, the child they loved but couldn't quite figure out how to brag about at church or neighborhood barbecues. While Jessica was arguing cases in court, I was piecing together a living through freelance graphic design, part-time work at Brewster's Corner coffee shop, and whatever creative projects I could squeeze in between paying rent and student loans. The irony is that I was good at what I did. Really good. My designs had helped 3 local businesses double their customer engagement. The logo I created for the new veterinary clinic had been featured in a regional design magazine. But try explaining that to a family that measures success in salary figures and job titles that sound impressive at cocktail parties. The morning of the reunion, I'd actually been excited. For the first time in months, I had genuinely good news to share. After years of building my portfolio and reputation quietly, a major opportunity had finally presented itself. Dr. Michael Bennett, who ran a creative consulting firm in Chicago, had reached out about my work. Not just any work, but a project I'd completed entirely on my own time, a rebranding campaign for a struggling nonprofit that had resulted in a 400% increase in donations. The message had come through LinkedIn 3 days earlier. Alex, your work with River Valley Children's Foundation caught our attention. We're expanding our team and looking for someone with your specific blend of creative vision and measurable impact. Would you be interested in discussing a senior creative director position? The role would involve leading campaigns for major clients and building our Midwest division. Compensation package starts at $90,000, plus equity and full creative control over your projects. I'd read it 17 times before believing it was real. $90,000. In Chicago, with creative control. Everything I'd been working toward, everything I'd been criticized for pursuing, had finally aligned into an opportunity that even the Thompsons couldn't dismiss as just playing around on computers. I'd planned to announce it during the family dinner, right after Dad finished his traditional toast about family achievements. Jessica would share her latest courtroom victory, Tyler would update everyone on his promotion at the bank, and then I'd drop the news that would finally shift the narrative. Alex Thompson, no longer the family question mark, but the creative director with the six-figure salary and the corner office in the third largest city in America. The reunion started like they always did. Mom spent the morning in full stress mode, orchestrating the perfect family gathering like she was planning a state dinner. Dad manned the grill with military precision, wearing the king of the barbecue apron we'd given him for Father's Day 5 years ago. Aunt Caroline arrived early with her famous 7-layer salad, and immediately started asking everyone about their lives with genuine interest, the one family member who never made anyone feel defensive about their choices. Jessica swept in at exactly 2 o'clock, her lawyer husband David in tow, looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for successful young professionals. She hugged everyone with calculated warmth, complimented Mom's decorations, and seamlessly transitioned into sharing the news of her latest case victory before most people had finished their first glass of lemonade. I waited, I chatted with cousins, helped serve food, played catch with Tyler's kids, and waited for the right moment. The opportunity would come during dinner when Dad would stand up, clink his glass, and give everyone the floor to share their updates. It was Thompson family tradition, and it was going to be my moment. But Jessica had other plans. It started when cousin Megan asked me what I'd been up to lately. A simple question, the kind that gets asked at every family gathering. I mentioned that I'd been working on some exciting projects, and might have some big news to share later. Nothing dramatic, just enough to hint that good things were happening without stealing thunder from the official announcement time. That's when Jessica, who'd been half listening while scrolling through her phone, looked up with that expression I knew too well.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Well, the one that said she was about to correct something she perceived as wrong or exaggerated. She set down her phone and turned to face me directly, which immediately drew attention from the nearby conversations. What kind of exciting projects? She asked, using her courtroom voice, the one designed to make witnesses second-guess themselves. I should have deflected. I should have said we'd talk about it later during the family toast. Instead, I made the mistake of treating my sister like she was genuinely interested in my life. I mentioned the Chicago opportunity, the consulting firm, the fact that someone had noticed my work and wanted to bring me onto their team. Jessica's eyebrows went up in that way that signaled she was shifting into cross-examination mode. Chicago, she said, loud enough that Uncle Dave stopped mid-fishing story. What's the name of this company? I told her, Dr. Bennett's Creative Consulting Solutions. It sounded official when I said it out loud, professional, like the kind of company that would impress the Thompson family standards. And they just reached out to you randomly. The skepticism in her voice was getting sharper, drawing more attention from around the yard. They saw my work with River Valley Children's Foundation, the campaign I did for them pro bono last year. I was starting to feel defensive, which always made me explain too much. The results were really strong, and Dr. Bennett thought my approach would be valuable for his client base. That's when Jessica laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the laugh of someone who thinks they're dealing with a child who doesn't understand how the world works. Alex, honey, you can't just quit your real job because someone sends you a nice message on LinkedIn. That's not how professional opportunities work. The conversation was getting louder, drawing more family members into the circle. I felt trapped but tried to defend the opportunity. It's not just a message, Jess. We've had phone conversations. They've reviewed my portfolio. This is legitimate. Her voice was getting that edge it had when she was about to deliver a closing argument. You mean like when you were going to be a famous photographer, or when you were going to start that design studio with your college friend, or when you were going to make money selling prints online. Each example hit like a physical blow because they were all true. They were all things I'd been excited about, had worked on, had talked about with family before they quietly faded away, but this felt different. This was someone else reaching out to me, validating my work, offering me exactly what I'd been building toward. "This is different," I said, but even as I said it, I could hear how it sounded to everyone listening. That's when Jessica delivered the line that changed everything. She looked around at our assembled family, smiled like she was about to share a piece of wisdom, and said, "Seriously, Alex, you're 28 years old, still living in that tiny apartment, bouncing between odd jobs, and now you want to quit your steady income to chase some pipe dream. Face it, you're the family disappointment." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kids stopped running through the sprinklers. 30 people, all staring at me, waiting to see how I would respond to being called the family disappointment at our annual reunion, in front of everyone I'd grown up wanting to make proud. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Aunt Caroline's face showed genuine pain, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how to interrupt the moment. Mom looked mortified, caught between defending me and not wanting to cause a scene. Dad was staring at his shoes, probably calculating how to smooth this over later. But most of them, if I'm being honest, looked like Jessica had just said what they'd all been thinking. Tyler nodded slightly, Uncle Dave cleared his throat and looked away. Cousin Megan suddenly became very interested in her potato salad. The uncomfortable laughter that rippled through the group wasn't disagreement with Jessica's assessment, it was recognition. I stood there holding my paper plate, feeling the weight of 28 years of being the Thompson family ? And realized that nothing I could say in that moment would change their minds. I could pull out my phone and show them Dr. Bennett's messages. I could explain the impact of my nonprofit work, the clients I'd helped, the recognition I'd received, but they'd already decided who I was, and more importantly, who I wasn't. So instead of defending myself, instead of arguing, or getting upset or causing the kind of family drama that would be talked about for years, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I smiled, set down my plate, and said, "You know what, Jess, you're absolutely right. I am the family disappointment, but I think I'm okay with that." Then I walked inside, grabbed my keys from the counter, and left the Thompson family reunion for what I thought might be the last time. What I didn't know was that leaving that backyard was the smartest thing I'd ever done, because sometimes the best way to prove someone wrong isn't to argue with them in the moment. Sometimes it's to quietly go build the life they said you'd never have, and let the results speak for themselves. The drive home from my parents' house to my tiny downtown apartment usually took 15 minutes. That day, it took 2 hours, because I kept pulling over, sitting in parking lots, trying to process what had just happened. Not just Jessica's words, but the reaction of everyone else. The nods, the silence, the way they'd all just accepted that yes, Alex was indeed the disappointment, and Jessica was simply stating an obvious truth. By the time I finally walked into my apartment, the anger had settled into something colder and more focused. I sat on my second-hand couch, opened my laptop, and did something I'd been afraid to do since receiving Dr. Bennett's message 3 days earlier. I called the number he'd provided, and asked if his offer was still on the table. "Alex," Dr. Bennett's voice was warm even over the phone. "I was hoping to hear from you. Did you have a chance to think about our conversation?" I looked around my small apartment, thought about the family gathering I'd just left, and realized I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. "I'm in," I said. "When do we start?" Dr. Bennett's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Excellent. How soon can you be in Chicago for a face-to-face meeting? I know this is moving quickly, but we have a major client presentation next Friday, and I'd love for you to be part of it." My heart started racing. Next Friday was 6 days away. What would that involve exactly? Madison Wells Industries is looking to rebrand their entire consumer division. It's a 12-month project worth about $2.4 million to our firm. I've seen your work, Alex, and your approach to emotional storytelling through design is exactly what they need. This could be your first major project as senior creative director. I tried to process what he was saying. A $2.4 million project, my first week on the job, everything I'd been working toward, condensed into an opportunity that most people spent decades trying to reach. I can be there Tuesday, I heard myself saying, though I had no idea how I was going to make that happen. I had exactly $437 in my checking account, no professional wardrobe suitable for a major client presentation, and a life in Riverside that I'd need to untangle in less than a week. Perfect. I'll have my assistant send you the details. Oh, and Alex, don't worry about the presentation materials, just bring yourself and that brilliant mind I've been hearing about. We'll handle everything else. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the phone like it might disappear, taking the opportunity with it. The contrast between this conversation and what had happened 3 hours earlier at the family reunion felt surreal. Here was someone who not only believed in my abilities, but was offering me a chance to prove them on a scale I'd never imagined. The next morning, I called Casey Williams, my best friend since college, and the one person who'd always understood my creative ambitions. Casey worked in marketing for a tech startup in Cincinnati, and had been encouraging me for years to think bigger, to stop treating my design work like a hobby, and start treating it like the career it could become. Are you kidding me right now? Casey's voice went up 3 octaves when I explained the situation. Alex, this is it. This is what you've been building toward. Please tell me you're not overthinking this. I'm definitely overthinking this, I admitted. Casey, what if I'm not ready? What if this Dr. Bennett guy has the wrong impression of my experience level? What if I get to Chicago and realize I'm completely out of my league? Stop, Casey said firmly. Do you remember the campaign you did for River Valley? The one that quadrupled their donations? Of course. Do you remember how you spent 3 months researching child psychology, family demographics, and nonprofit funding trends before you even started sketching concepts? I did remember. I'd treated that pro bono project like it was the most important assignment of my life, diving deeper into research than any paying client had ever required. Do you remember how the executive director cried when she saw the final presentation, because it captured everything she'd been trying to communicate about their mission for 15 years? That memory still gave me chills. Margaret Chen, the executive director, had been struggling to articulate why River Valley Children's Foundation was different from other nonprofits. My campaign hadn't just created visual materials, it had helped her organization understand its own identity and communicate it effectively for the first time. Alex, Casey continued, you didn't accidentally create something that impressive. You didn't stumble into results like that. You're ready for this, because you've been preparing for it without even realizing it. Every project you've worked on, every client you've helped, every late night you've spent perfecting something that most people would have called good enough, has been building toward this moment. That afternoon, I drove to the public library and spent 4 hours researching creative consulting solutions and Dr. Bennett himself. What I found made me feel both more confident and more nervous. The firm had worked with major brands like Nike, Starbucks, and Tesla. Their client list read like a Fortune 500 directory. Dr. Bennett had been featured in Fast Company, Forbes, and Design Week. His team's work had won international awards. This wasn't some small consulting firm looking for cheap talent. This was a major player in the creative industry, and they wanted me. The more I researched, the more I understood why Dr. Bennett had reached out. Creative Consulting Solutions specialized in what they called emotional architecture, the process of building brand connections through deep psychological and cultural insights. It was exactly the approach I'd been developing intuitively over the past few years, the method that had made my nonprofit work so effective. I spent the rest of the week preparing like my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. I updated my portfolio, researched Madison Wells Industries until I could recite their company history, and practiced presentation techniques in front of my bathroom mirror until my neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind. The hardest part was dealing with the aftermath of the family reunion. Mom called Tuesday evening, her voice careful and apologetic. "Alex, honey, I think we need to talk about what happened Sunday." "There's nothing to talk about, Mom." Jessica made her opinion clear, and apparently most of the family agrees with her. "That's not fair, and you know it. People were just caught off guard. Jessica was out of line, and your father and I should have said something in the moment." I appreciated her attempt to smooth things over, but the damage had been done. "Mom, it's okay. Actually, it might have been exactly what I needed to hear." "What do you mean?" I told her about Chicago, about Dr. Bennett, about Creative Consulting Solutions, about the Madison Wells project. As I talked, I could hear her surprise shifting into something that sounded like pride. "Alex, this sounds incredible. Why didn't you mention any of this at the reunion?" "I was going to. I was waiting for Dad's toast, so I could share it with everyone properly, but Jessica decided to share her assessment of my life first." There was a long silence. Then Mom said, "I think you should call her." "Mom, no. I'm not calling Jessica to ask for her approval or forgiveness. I'm 28 years old, and I'm done seeking validation from people who've already decided I'm not worth believing in. But she's your sister, and I'm her brother. That should have counted for something on Sunday." I could hear the pain in Mom's voice, but I also heard something else: understanding. Maybe for the first time, she was seeing the pattern that had defined my relationship with the family for years. The constant need to prove myself, to justify my choices, to apologize for not being the kind of success story they could easily brag about. Wednesday night, I got a text from Jessica: "We need to talk. Call me when you have a chance." I stared at that message for 20 minutes before deleting it. Whatever she wanted to say, whatever explanation or apology she might offer, it didn't change what had happened. More importantly, it didn't change what was about to happen. Thursday morning, I packed everything I owned into my 10-year-old Honda Civic. It wasn't much: some clothes, my computer, a few pieces of furniture that might survive the drive to Chicago, and the framed photo of my college graduation that had been sitting on my desk for 6 years. Looking at that photo, I remembered how hopeful I'd been, how certain that hard work and talent would eventually lead to recognition and success. The family hadn't come to that graduation. Jessica had a law school commitment, Dad had a work conference, and Mom had stayed home with him. Aunt Caroline had been the only relative there, cheering from the audience when they called my name, taking pictures that no one else in the family had asked to see. I called Aunt Caroline before leaving town. "Alex, sweetheart, I've been thinking about you all week. How are you holding up?" "I'm good, actually, better than good. I'm moving to Chicago." "Chicago, when? Why?" I explained the opportunity, the timeline, the fact that I was driving there that afternoon to start a new life. As I talked, Aunt Caroline got quieter, and I could hear her processing what this meant. "Alex," she finally said, "I need to tell you something. What Jessica said on Sunday, it doesn't represent what everyone thinks. It represents what she thinks, and maybe what some others think, but not everyone." "It's okay, Aunt Caroline, it really is." "No, it's not okay. I've watched you your entire life, and I've seen how hard you work, how much you care about doing things right, how you light up when you talk about your projects. I've also seen how this family has made you feel like none of that matters, because it doesn't fit their definition of success." Her words hit harder than I expected. Aunt Caroline had always been the family member who paid attention to things others missed, who remembered birthdays, and asked follow-up questions, and genuinely cared about the answers. "You know what I think," she continued. "I think Jessica is scared." "Scared? Of what?" "Of the possibility that you might be right, that there are ways to build a meaningful life that don't require following the traditional path. Jessica has spent her entire adult life checking boxes that other people told her were important: good grades, good school, good job, good marriage, good house. She's never questioned whether those boxes actually lead to happiness or fulfillment. I'd never thought about it that way. Jessica had always seemed so confident, so certain about her choices and her success. But you, Aunt Caroline said, you've been willing to risk failure in order to do work that matters to you. That takes a different kind of courage, and I think it threatens her worldview. If you succeed on your own terms, it suggests that maybe her terms weren't the only ones that mattered. Do you really think that's what this is about? I think your sister loves you, but I also think she's spent so many years being praised for following the rules, that she doesn't know how to support someone who's willing to break them, even when breaking them leads to something beautiful. I sat in my car outside my apartment building, holding the phone, feeling something shift in my understanding of the family dynamics that had shaped my entire life. Aunt Caroline, yes honey, thank you, for seeing me, for believing in me, for understanding that there might be value in the path I've been trying to build. Alex, I don't just believe in you, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of your creativity, your determination, and your willingness to keep trying even when it would be easier to give up. I'm proud that you're brave enough to move to Chicago, to chase an opportunity that excites you, and I'm proud that you're doing it with grace, without burning bridges or seeking revenge on people who couldn't see your worth. I love you, Aunt Caroline. I love you too, sweetheart. Now go show Chicago what we've always known, that Alex Thompson is someone special. The drive to Chicago took 4 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. With each mile, I was leaving behind not just a city but an identity I'd been carrying for 28 years. The Alex Thompson who apologized for his ambitions, who downplayed his achievements, who spent family gatherings feeling defensive about his life choices. That person was staying in Riverside. The Alex Thompson driving into Chicago was someone different, someone who had been personally recruited by a major creative firm, someone whose work had impressed industry professionals, someone who was about to walk into a conference room and present ideas to executives who controlled million-dollar budgets. I arrived at my extended stay hotel Thursday evening, exhausted but exhilarated. The room was small but clean, with a view of the downtown skyline that made everything feel possible. I ordered pizza, spread my portfolio materials across the bed, and practiced my introduction one more time. Hi, I'm Alex Thompson, Senior Creative Director with Creative Consulting Solutions. I'm excited to share how emotional architecture can transform Madison Wells' consumer brand connection. It sounded professional, it sounded confident, it sounded like someone Jessica would have to acknowledge as successful, even by Thompson family standards. Friday morning, I woke up at 5:30, spent an hour getting ready, and arrived at the Creative Consulting Solutions offices an hour early. The building was everything I'd expected: sleek, modern, buzzing with creative energy. The lobby featured award-winning campaigns from the firm's portfolio, each one representing the kind of work I'd been dreaming about contributing to. Dr. Bennett met me in the lobby at exactly 8 o'clock. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from years of successful client presentations. But what struck me most was how he greeted me, not as someone doing me a favor, but as a valuable colleague he was excited to work with. Alex, welcome to Chicago. Are you ready to change Madison Wells' entire approach to consumer engagement? I looked around the lobby, at the creative work displayed on the walls, at the team members arriving for what was clearly going to be an important day, and realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't the Thompson family disappointment anymore. I was Alex Thompson, creative director, and I was exactly where I belonged. Let's do this, I said, and meant every word. The Madison Wells presentation was scheduled for 10:30, which gave Dr. Bennett 2 hours to brief me on the client situation, introduce me to the core team, and review our strategic approach. What I discovered during those 2 hours changed my understanding of what this opportunity really meant. Madison Wells Industries wasn't just looking for a rebrand, they were facing an existential crisis. Their consumer division, which had been profitable for 40 years, was hemorrhaging market share to younger, more agile competitors. Their traditional marketing approaches weren't resonating with new demographics. Their brand identity, built around reliability and tradition, was being perceived as outdated and irrelevant. They've worked with 3 different agencies over the past 2 years, Dr. Bennett explained as we reviewed client materials in his office. Each one has given them variations of the same advice: modernize your logo, update your color palette, create social media campaigns that feel more contemporary. But none of that has addressed the fundamental problem, which is they don't understand who they're trying to connect with anymore. They know their traditional customer base is aging out, but they're trying to attract younger consumers using the same emotional triggers that worked 30 years ago. It's like trying to have a conversation in a language the other person doesn't speak. This was exactly the kind of challenge that excited me. Not just changing visual elements, but understanding the deeper psychological and cultural shifts that required completely new approaches to brand communication. The work you did with River Valley, Dr. Bennett continued. That's what caught our attention. You didn't just create prettier materials, you identified the fundamental disconnect between how they saw themselves and how their audience experienced them, then built a bridge between those two perspectives. He pulled up the River Valley campaign on his computer, and I felt a familiar surge of pride looking at work that had consumed 3 months of my life. The visual identity we'd created was clean and modern, but the real innovation had been in the messaging strategy. Instead of focusing on the organization's internal priorities, we'd built everything around the stories and experiences of the families they served. Madison Wells needs that same kind of insight, Dr. Bennett said. They need someone who can look beyond their assumptions about what their brand should communicate and discover what their audience actually wants to hear. The team meeting at 9 o'clock was unlike any professional environment I'd ever experienced. Instead of the hierarchical, formal atmosphere I'd expected, it felt more like a creative workshop. Ideas were shared openly, disagreement was encouraged, and everyone seemed genuinely invested in producing the best possible outcome for the client. Sarah Kim, the senior strategist, had spent weeks analyzing Madison Wells' competitor landscape and consumer research. Marcus Rodriguez, the lead designer, had mock-ups that explored visual directions ranging from subtle evolution to complete reinvention. Jennifer Walsh, the account manager, understood the client's internal politics and decision-making process better than they probably understood it themselves. But what struck me most was how they responded when Dr. Bennett introduced me as the new senior creative director who would be leading the Madison Wells relationship. There was no resentment, no territorial behavior, no sense that I was stepping into someone else's domain. Instead, there was curiosity about my perspective and genuine excitement about collaborative possibilities. Alex Sarah said after reviewing my nonprofit portfolio, "Your approach to audience segmentation is fascinating. Most agencies create demographic categories based on age, income, geography, but you're identifying emotional and psychological segments that cut across traditional boundaries." She was right. The River Valley campaign had succeeded because we'd stopped thinking about donors as income brackets and started thinking about them as people with different motivations for charitable giving. Some were driven by personal experience with childhood trauma, others were motivated by community connection. Still others were focused on measurable impact and social change. By creating different messaging tracks that spoke to these different psychological drivers, we'd been able to connect with audiences that previous campaigns had missed entirely. That's exactly what Madison Wells needs, Marcus added. Their consumer base isn't just people who buy household products, it's people with different relationships to home, family, quality, convenience, environmental responsibility. If we can identify those emotional segments, we can create campaigns that feel personally relevant instead of generically appealing. For the next hour, we brainstormed approaches to the Madison Wells challenge that I never could have developed alone. The team's expertise complemented my instincts in ways that made our collective thinking more sophisticated than any of our individual perspectives. By 10:15, we had outlined a presentation strategy that went far beyond rebranding. We were proposing a fundamental shift in how Madison Wells understood their relationship with consumers, supported by research methodologies, creative concepts, and implementation timelines that would transform their entire marketing approach. Are you ready for this, Doctor? Bennett asked as we gathered our materials and headed toward the conference room. I thought about the family reunion 5 days earlier, about Jessica's dismissive laughter, about the years I'd spent apologizing for pursuing work that felt meaningful instead of just profitable. Then I looked around at this team of creative professionals who treated my ideas like valuable contributions, who saw potential in my approach, who trusted me to represent their firm in front of a major client. I've been ready for this my entire life, I said, and realized it was true. The Madison Wells executives arrived precisely at 10:33, middle-aged men in conservative suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate handbook from 1995. They introduced themselves with firm handshakes and business cards, then settled into chairs around the conference table with the resigned expressions of people who'd been through this process too many times before. Dr. Bennett handled the introductions and context, but when it came time to present our strategic approach, he turned to me. Alex Thompson, our senior creative director, will walk you through our analysis and recommendations. This was it. The moment that would either validate everything I'd been working toward or confirm that I really was out of my league. I looked at the three executives, opened my portfolio, and began to speak. Gentlemen, before we discuss visual identity or marketing tactics, I'd like you to close your eyes and think about the last time you felt genuinely excited about coming home. The three Madison Wells executives looked at each other with barely concealed confusion. This clearly wasn't how their previous agency presentations had begun. The youngest of them, probably the VP of marketing, started to speak, but I continued. I'm serious, close your eyes. Think about walking through your front door after a long day and feeling that sense of relief, comfort, safety. What made that feeling possible? Was it the physical space, the people waiting for you? The knowledge that everything you needed was within reach? Slowly, reluctantly, they closed their eyes. Dr. Bennett and the team watched with interest as I moved away from the traditional PowerPoint approach and into something more experiential. That feeling you just accessed, that's not about household products, it's about the emotional architecture of home. And that's what your consumers are actually buying when they choose Madison Wells products. They're not purchasing dish soap or laundry detergent. They're investing in their ability to create and maintain the spaces where their most important relationships happen. I opened my laptop and projected the first slide, not a company logo or mission statement, but a simple question: what does home feel like? For the past 40 years, Madison Wells has been selling functional solutions to household maintenance problems. Your messaging has focused on effectiveness, value, reliability. All important attributes, but they're talking to people's heads, not their hearts. Meanwhile, your competitors are building emotional connections that transcend product categories. The senior executive, probably the division president based on how the others deferred to him, opened his eyes and leaned forward. What do you mean by emotional connections? I clicked to the next slide, which showed social media campaigns from three of their major competitors. Method doesn't just sell cleaning products, they sell the satisfaction of creating a beautiful toxin-free environment for your family. Seventh Generation doesn't just sell laundry detergent, they sell participation in environmental responsibility that your children will inherit. Mrs. Myers doesn't just sell dish soap, they sell the sensory pleasure of transforming a mundane chore into something that smells like your grandmother's garden. The room was completely quiet. Even Sarah and Marcus, who'd helped develop this analysis, were listening intently as I continued. Madison Wells has superior products, your research and development is outstanding, your quality control is exceptional, your distribution network is unmatched. But you're communicating those advantages in a language that younger consumers have stopped speaking. I clicked to a slide showing demographic research we'd conducted over the past week. Your traditional customer base, women aged 45 to 65, are loyal because they remember when product effectiveness was the primary decision-making factor. But consumers under 40 have grown up with dozens of effective options in every product category. For them, the decision isn't which product works best, it's which brand understands who they're trying to become. The VP of marketing was taking notes now, his earlier skepticism replaced by engaged attention. Can you give us a specific example? Absolutely. Let's talk about your premium dish soap line. Your current messaging emphasizes grease-cutting power and long-lasting suds. Those are rational benefits that appeal to cost-conscious efficiency, but your target demographic isn't just trying to clean dishes efficiently. They're trying to create kitchen experiences that feel intentional, mindful, connected to their values about family, health, and home. I pulled up the mood board Marcus had prepared, showing aspirational kitchen scenes from social media platforms where younger consumers shared their daily routines. These aren't just functional spaces, they're stages for identity expression. The products in these kitchens aren't just tools, they're props in a lifestyle narrative about what kind of person lives here, what kind of family gathers here, what kind of values guide the decisions made here. The senior executive set down his pen and really looked at the images. So you're saying our products need to become part of their story about themselves? Exactly. And the beautiful thing is, Madison Wells products already fit perfectly into those stories. You just need to help people see the connection. For the next 30 minutes, I walked them through what we called the emotional architecture approach. Instead of organizing their product lines around functional categories, we proposed organizing them around lifestyle aspirations. The Mindful Mornings collection for people who wanted to start their days with intention. The Family Traditions line for consumers focused on creating memorable experiences with children. The Sustainable Choices range for environmentally conscious households. Each category would include products from across their current divisions, united not by what they did, but by the emotional outcomes they supported. The dish soap, laundry detergent, and surface cleaner in the Mindful Mornings collection would share visual identity, messaging themes, and marketing channels that spoke to people trying to transform daily routines into purposeful rituals. The messaging shift is subtle but powerful, I explained, showing mock-ups Jennifer had prepared. Instead of Madison Wells dish soap cuts through grease in seconds, we're saying start your day with intention. Madison Wells' Mindful Mornings collection turns everyday moments into opportunities for presence and care. The youngest executive looked skeptical. Isn't that a little fluffy? Our customers want to know that products actually work. Of course they do. And will communicate effectiveness, but as evidence that supports the emotional promise rather than as the primary value proposition. People don't buy products that just work anymore. They buy products that work and make them feel good about who they are. Dr. Bennett stepped in with supporting research. Alex is right. Our analysis of successful consumer brand pivots over the past 5 years shows that companies who lead with emotional connection and support it with functional proof consistently outperform brands that do the opposite. I could see the Madison Wells team processing this shift. It wasn't just about changing advertising copy, it was about fundamentally reorienting how they understood their relationship with consumers. What would this look like in practice? The senior executive asked. I clicked to our implementation timeline. Phase 1 would be research and testing. We'd conduct qualitative interviews with your target demographics to map the emotional landscape around home and family routines. Phase 2 would be prototype development, creating new product lines and messaging strategies based on those insights. Phase 3 would be limited market testing to validate the approach before full rollout. Timeline: 18 months for complete implementation, but you'd start seeing results from the first test markets within 6 months. The room fell silent as they absorbed the scope of what we were proposing. This wasn't the incremental adjustment they'd been expecting. It was a comprehensive transformation of their brand strategy. Finally, the senior executive spoke. This is ambitious. Much more comprehensive than what other agencies have presented. I felt my heart start to race, uncertain whether that was positive or negative feedback. It's also, he continued, the first presentation that's made me excited about our possibilities instead of worried about our problems. The relief that washed over me was so intense, I had to focus on keeping my expression professional. Dr. Bennett caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. We'd like to move forward with Phase 1, the VP of Marketing said. What would you need from us to get started? The rest of the meeting was logistics and timelines, budget discussions and team assignments. But I barely heard any of it because I was trying to process what had just happened. I'd walked into a room full of strangers and convinced them to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in an approach I'd developed based on work I'd done for free. I'd taken everything I'd learned from years of small projects and transformed it into a strategy that impressed executives from a Fortune 500 company. After the Madison Wells team left, Dr. Bennett gathered our team in his office for debriefing. "Alex," he said, "that was exceptional. You didn't just present ideas, you changed how they think about their business." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "The way you connected product functionality to emotional aspiration, I've never seen a client respond that positively to such a dramatic strategic shift." "And the presentation style," Marcus added, "starting with that experiential exercise instead of slides, it immediately differentiated us from every other agency they've worked with." I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that I'd never experienced in a professional context. This wasn't just praise for completing an assignment, it was recognition from peers who understood the complexity of what I'd accomplished. "So what happens next?" I asked. "Next," Dr. Bennett said, "you build the team that's going to execute this vision. We'll need researchers, strategists, designers, and account managers who understand the emotional architecture approach. This is going to be one of our largest client relationships, and you're going to be leading every aspect of it." That evening, I sat in my hotel room, staring out at the Chicago skyline, trying to absorb the magnitude of how my life had changed in less than a week. 7 days ago, I'd been the Thompson family disappointment, serving coffee and piecing together freelance projects. Tonight, I was the senior creative director responsible for a multi-million-dollar brand transformation for a major consumer products company. I thought about calling my family, sharing the news of the successful presentation and the scope of the opportunity ahead, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Jessica's dismissive laughter, or the uncomfortable silence that had followed her assessment of my life. Maybe it was the realization that their approval no longer felt as important as it once had. Instead, I called Casey. "Alex, how did it go? I've been checking my phone every 10 minutes waiting to hear from you." "It went well," I said, then immediately realized how insufficient that was. "Actually, Casey, it went better than well, it went perfectly. They loved the approach, they're moving forward with the full project, and I'm going to be leading a team of people who are way more experienced than I am." "Oh my God, Alex, this is incredible. Tell me everything." For the next hour, I walked Casey through the entire presentation, the client's response, the team's feedback, and the scope of what I'd be working on over the next 18 months. As I talked, I could hear the excitement in my own voice, the confidence that came from being recognized for exactly the kind of work I'd always wanted to do. "You know what I keep thinking about," Casey said when I finished. "Remember junior year when you spent that entire semester redesigning the student center's promotional materials because you thought their approach was missing the point?" I did remember. I'd been so frustrated with how the university was communicating about student services that I'd created an entire alternative campaign just to prove it could be done better. The administration had never seen it, but my professors had been impressed enough to recommend me for an internship. "You've been thinking like a senior creative director for years," Casey continued. "You just finally found people who needed that kind of thinking and could recognize it when they saw it." That night, I started a list of everything I wanted to accomplish over the next year. Not just professional goals, but personal ones. I wanted to build a team of people who shared my passion for meaningful creative work. I wanted to prove that the emotional architecture approach could be applied across industries and client types. I wanted to become the kind of mentor for young creatives that I'd never had but always needed. And somewhere on that list, though I didn't write it down, was the goal of showing my family that their assessment of my potential had been not just wrong, but dramatically, undeniably wrong. The next few weeks passed in a blur of apartment hunting, team building, and project development. Dr. Bennett had been serious about giving me autonomy over the Madison Wells relationship. I was involved in every hiring decision, every strategic discussion, every client communication. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility, I felt energized by it. The team we assembled was exceptional. Lisa Park, a research psychologist who specialized in consumer behavior and family dynamics. James Mitchell, a brand strategist with experience in emotional marketing for lifestyle brands. Maria Santos, a designer whose portfolio perfectly captured the aesthetic sensibility we needed for the emotional architecture approach. Tom Wheeler, an account manager who understood how to translate creative vision into client-friendly business language. Each of them was more experienced than I was in their respective specialties, but they all seemed genuinely excited to be working on something that felt innovative and meaningful. Our team meetings felt more like graduate seminars than corporate strategy sessions, with everyone contributing insights that made our collective thinking more sophisticated. The Madison Wells research phase revealed everything we'd suspected and more. Consumers under 40 weren't just looking for functional household products, they were looking for brands that understood their aspirations about family, home, health, and environmental responsibility. They wanted to feel like their purchasing decisions reflected their values and supported the kind of life they were trying to build. But they were also overwhelmed by choice and skeptical of marketing that felt manipulative or inauthentic. The brands that succeeded with this demographic were the ones that felt like partners in their lifestyle goals rather than companies trying to sell them products. Madison Wells had all the raw materials for this kind of relationship. Their products were genuinely high quality, their manufacturing practices were more sustainable than most competitors, their company values aligned with what younger consumers said they cared about. They just needed help communicating those attributes in a way that felt emotionally relevant. The breakthrough came during our third week of research, when we were conducting focus groups with families in suburban Chicago. Instead of asking people about their household product preferences, we asked them to describe their ideal evening at home after a long day. The responses were remarkably consistent. People wanted to feel like their homes were refuges from the chaos and stress of the outside world. They wanted routines that felt restorative rather than just functional. They wanted to create environments where their families could connect, recharge, and prepare for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. That's it, I said to the team after reviewing the focus group transcripts. Home isn't a place you maintain, it's a feeling you create. And Madison Wells products can be tools in that creation process. Maria immediately understood the implications, so the visual identity shouldn't look like cleaning products, it should look like wellness products, like lifestyle products, like tools for creating the emotional experience of home. James nodded enthusiastically. And the messaging shouldn't be about product features, it should be about the emotional outcomes those features make possible. Lisa was already sketching research methodologies. We need to map the specific emotional journey of creating home. What does it feel like when someone walks into a space that smells clean versus a space that smells like artificial fragrance? How do people's stress levels change when their environment feels organized and cared for? Tom was thinking about client communication. Madison Wells executives are going to love this. We're not just giving them a new marketing strategy, we're giving them a competitive advantage based on deep consumer insight. That afternoon, I called Dr. Bennett to share our breakthrough and schedule a client presentation for the following week. Alex, he said, this sounds like exactly the kind of thinking that's going to establish our firm as the leader in emotional architecture consulting. You've taken a theoretical approach and turned it into actionable strategy. I couldn't have done it without this team. Everyone has contributed insights that changed how I understand the problem. That's what leadership looks like in creative work, Dr. Bennett said. It's not about having all the answers yourself, it's about creating conditions where other people can contribute their best thinking toward a shared vision. I hung up feeling like I'd received more than professional praise. I'd been given a framework for understanding how to be the kind of leader I wanted to become, someone who elevated other people's capabilities rather than just showcasing my own. That evening, I walked through downtown Chicago, marveling at how different everything felt compared to just a month earlier. I had an apartment with actual furniture, a job that challenged me intellectually and creatively, colleagues who respected my ideas, and a client relationship that could define my career trajectory. But more than any of those external changes, I had a sense of professional identity that felt authentic and sustainable. I wasn't trying to fit into someone else's definition of success, I was building success on my own terms, using skills and insights that felt uniquely mine. As I walked past the restaurants and shops, I thought about Jessica and the family reunion that had set all of this in motion. Her assessment of my life had been accurate in the narrow terms she'd used to measure success. I had been living in a small apartment, working odd jobs, pursuing opportunities that looked uncertain and unprofitable. But she'd missed something fundamental. She'd seen the external circumstances without understanding the internal preparation that had been happening. Every freelance project, every late-night perfecting work that no one had asked me to improve, every moment of doubt and persistence had been building toward this moment when the right opportunity would finally align with my capabilities. I wasn't the Thompson family disappointment anymore. I was Alex Thompson, Senior Creative Director, leader of innovative brand strategy, someone whose ideas were changing how a Fortune 500 company understood its relationship with consumers, and I was just getting started. The Madison Wells presentation the following week went even better than our initial meeting. When we showed them the research findings about the emotional architecture of home, the senior executive actually smiled for the first time in any of our interactions. "This is fascinating," he said, reviewing the focus group summaries. "We've been thinking about our customers as people who need to clean things, but they're really people who want to create sanctuary." "Exactly," I responded. "And when you understand that fundamental motivation, everything else becomes clearer. The product formulations, the packaging design, the retail placement, the marketing channels. It all needs to support that primary emotional goal." The VP of Marketing was already thinking about implementation. "How quickly can we start testing this approach in select markets?" "We can have prototype campaigns ready for testing within 6 weeks," Maria answered. "The beauty of the emotional architecture approach is that it doesn't require changing your manufacturing or distribution. It's about recontextualizing what you're already doing exceptionally well." By the end of the meeting, we had approval for the largest single project in creative consulting solutions history. 18 months, multiple product lines, comprehensive brand repositioning, national rollout. It was the kind of client relationship that agencies spent decades trying to build. As the Madison Wells team gathered their materials to leave, the senior executive pulled me aside. "Alex, I want you to know that this approach you've developed, it's not just going to change our business. It's going to change how we think about what we do and who we serve. That's rare in consulting relationships." Walking back to the office after the client meeting, Dr. Bennett put his hand on my shoulder. "You realize what just happened, don't you? We got approval for the full project. You just established yourself as one of the leading thinkers in emotional brand strategy. Word is going to spread about this approach, and every consumer products company in the country is going to want to understand how to apply it to their business." That afternoon, I sat in my office, looking out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about how to communicate this success to my family back in Riverside. The professional triumph was clear and measurable. The personal transformation was harder to quantify but somehow more significant. I'd learned that being underestimated by people you love is painful, but it doesn't
have to define your possibilities. I'd discovered that the right opportunity can validate years of preparation that seem to lead nowhere. And I'd realized that the most satisfying kind of success is the kind that feels authentically connected to who you actually are. But most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the best response to being called a disappointment isn't to argue or defend yourself. Sometimes it's to quietly go build the life that proves them wrong, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. The phone call I'd been avoiding finally came that evening. "Jessica?" I stared at Jessica's name on my phone screen for 3 rings before answering. "Alex." Her voice sounded different, less confident, maybe even hesitant. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I've been busy. Mom told me about Chicago. About your job. I wanted to." She paused, and I could hear her struggling with words that didn't come naturally. "I wanted to apologize." The silence stretched between us across the 400 miles that separated Chicago from Riverside. I sat in my apartment, looking out at the city lights, holding a conversation I'd imagined dozens of times, but never expected to actually have. Apologize for what specifically? For what I said at the reunion, for how I said it, for doing it in front of everyone. Jessica's voice got quieter. Mom showed me the article about your company in Design Week, the one that mentioned the Madison Wells project and called your approach revolutionary. I had no idea you were working on anything like that. The Design Week article had been a surprise to all of us. Apparently, someone at Madison Wells had talked to industry reporters about their brand repositioning project, and our emotional architecture approach had caught the attention of marketing publications. Seeing my name and photo in a national trade magazine had felt surreal, but also validating in a way I hadn't expected. Would it have mattered if you'd known? I asked. What do you mean? If I'd managed to explain the Chicago opportunity at the reunion before you decided to share your assessment of my life with the entire family, would you have responded differently? Jessica was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard since we were children. Probably not. And that's what I'm really calling to apologize for. Not just for that day, but for years of not taking you seriously. For treating your creative work like a hobby instead of a career, for assuming that because your path didn't look like mine, it wasn't leading anywhere meaningful. I felt something loosening in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. But Jessica wasn't finished. Alex, I need you to understand something. What I did at the reunion, it wasn't just about you, it was about me feeling threatened by the possibility that you might be right about something I've been wrong about my entire adult life. What do you mean? I've spent 10 years building a career that looks successful from the outside but feels empty most of the time. I work 60-hour weeks on cases I don't care about for clients I don't respect, making money I don't need to buy things that don't make me happy. And then I watch you turning down stable jobs to pursue work that excites you, and some part of me knows that you're living more authentically than I am. This wasn't the conversation I'd expected. I'd prepared for defensiveness, justification, maybe another attempt to diminish my accomplishments. I hadn't prepared for honesty. Jessica, let me finish, she said, and I could hear her crying now. When you walked out of that reunion, I felt relieved because it meant I didn't have to confront the possibility that courage looks different than I thought. That maybe following the safe path isn't actually safer if it means spending your life doing work that doesn't matter to you. I sat with her words, trying to process this version of my sister that I'd never encountered before. The Jessica I'd grown up with was certain, judgmental, quick to dismiss perspectives that didn't align with her worldview. This Jessica sounded lost, questioning, almost desperate for connection. Why are you telling me this now? Because 3 weeks ago I was offered partnership at my firm. Everything I've been working toward for 10 years, the culmination of every sacrifice I've made, every hour I've billed, every weekend I've spent in the office instead of living my life. That's incredible, Jess. Congratulations. I turned it down. The words hit me like cold water. Jessica had been talking about making partners since law school. It was the singular goal that had driven every decision in her professional life. You what? I turned it down. And when they asked me why, I heard myself saying that I wanted to find work that felt more personally meaningful. I didn't plan to say that. I didn't even know I was thinking it until the words came out of my mouth. I could picture Jessica sitting in some conference room, surrounded by senior partners who'd spent years grooming her for advancement, explaining that she was walking away from everything they assumed she wanted. What did they say? They were confused. They offered me time to think about it, suggested I might be experiencing burnout, asked if there were personal circumstances affecting my judgment. Nobody understood how someone could walk away from partnership track at a prestigious firm to pursue something more meaningful. And what are you going to do? I have no idea. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have a 5-year plan or a clear next step or a strategy for advancing toward a predetermined goal. It's terrifying and liberating, and I have no idea how you've lived with this kind of uncertainty for so long. I found myself smiling despite everything that had passed between us. You get used to it, And eventually you realize that uncertainty isn't the same thing as being lost. Sometimes it just means you're brave enough to admit you don't know where you're going yet. Alex, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Okay. Do you think it's too late for me to find work that actually matters? I'm 31 years old. I've spent my entire career in corporate law. I have a mortgage and student loans and a lifestyle that requires a certain income level. Am I being naive to think I could start over? The vulnerability in her question made me understand something I'd never seen before. Jessica's criticism of my choices hadn't just been about different definitions of success. It had been about fear that her own choices had trapped her in a life that didn't fit who she actually was. Jess, 3 months ago I was serving coffee and living paycheck to paycheck. Today I'm leading brand strategy for a Fortune 500 company. If I can make that transition, you can figure out how to use your legal training in ways that feel more meaningful. But how? How do you even begin to identify what kind of work would feel meaningful when you've spent so long doing work that pays the bills? You start by paying attention to what excites you when nobody's watching. What do you read about in your spare time? What kinds of conversations make you lose track of time? What problems in the world make you angry or sad enough that you actually want to do something about them? Jessica was quiet for a moment. I keep reading articles about criminal justice reform, about how the legal system fails people who can't afford good representation, about how many problems could be prevented if there were better legal services for low-income communities. That sounds like the beginning of an answer. But how do you make a living doing that kind of work? I don't know. But I bet there are people who do know, and I bet they'd be excited to talk to a corporate lawyer who wants to transition into public interest work. The same way Dr. Bennett was excited to talk to a freelance designer who'd figured out how to create emotional connections through brand strategy. We talked for another hour, and slowly I began to understand the weight Jessica had been carrying. The pressure to justify every sacrifice she'd made in pursuit of conventional success. The fear that admitting dissatisfaction would mean acknowledging that years of her life had been wasted. The isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who assume you're happy because you're successful by traditional metrics. Alex, there's something else I need to tell you. What? I'm proud of you. Not just because of the Chicago job or the magazine article or the client success. I'm proud of you for having the courage to trust yourself when everyone around you, including me, was telling you to be practical. I'm proud of you for believing that your work could matter even when you had no proof that anyone else would recognize its value. The words I'd been waiting to hear my entire life, delivered over the phone from 400 miles away, at a moment when I finally didn't need them for validation. But I was surprised by how much they still meant. Thank you, Jess. That means more than you know. Can I ask you one more thing? Sure. Would you be willing to help me figure out what my version of meaningful work might look like? Not as your older sister who knows better, but as someone who's trying to learn from your example. 6 months later, Jessica left her corporate firm to join a nonprofit legal advocacy organization in Columbus. The pay cut was substantial, but she seemed lighter every time we talked, more engaged with her daily work than I'd ever heard her sound. She wasn't the only family member whose perspective shifted in the months following the Chicago breakthrough. As news of the Madison Wells success spread through industry publications and creative conferences, the Thompson family narrative began to change. I was no longer the question mark who made everyone uncomfortable at gatherings. I was the creative director whose innovative approach was being studied by marketing graduate programs. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It happened through small moments over time. Dad started asking genuine questions about my work instead of making polite conversation about it. Mom began sharing updates about my projects with her friends, describing my career with the same pride she'd always reserved for Jessica's achievements. Cousins started reaching out on LinkedIn, curious about opportunities in creative consulting. But the most meaningful change was with Aunt Caroline, who called me one evening with excitement about a project she was working on. Alex, I hope you don't mind, but I shared your emotional architecture approach with the board of the Literacy Foundation where I volunteer. We've been struggling to communicate why adult literacy programs matter to potential donors, and your ideas about connecting with emotional motivations instead of just functional benefits gave us a completely new framework. That's amazing, Aunt Caroline. How can I help? Well, that's what I'm calling about. Would you be willing to do a pro bono consultation for us? Not a full campaign, just guidance on how to apply your strategic thinking to nonprofit fundraising. The Literacy Foundation project became the prototype for something I hadn't expected when I started at Creative Consulting Solutions. Within a year, we'd established a nonprofit consulting division that helped mission-driven organizations apply emotional architecture principles to their communications and fundraising strategies. The work was financially sustainable, but also personally fulfilling in ways that corporate consulting couldn't match. Dr. Bennett supported the expansion enthusiastically, recognizing that our nonprofit work enhanced our reputation with socially conscious corporate clients and attracted talented team members who wanted to balance profitable projects with meaningful impact. Alex, he said during one of our quarterly reviews, you've created something that most consulting firms spend decades trying to develop. A distinctive methodology that delivers measurable results, a team that's passionate about the work, and a client base that ranges from Fortune 500 companies to grassroots nonprofits. That's not just professional success, that's industry leadership. The Madison Wells project had exceeded everyone's expectations. Their emotional architecture rebrand resulted in double-digit market share growth in every demographic category under 45. The success had led to additional projects with other consumer products companies, establishing Creative Consulting Solutions as the premier firm for brands trying to build authentic emotional connections with younger consumers. But beyond the professional achievements, I'd discovered something more personally significant. The work I was doing felt authentically connected to who I was and what I cared about. I wasn't trying to fit into someone else's definition of success. I was building success on my own terms, using skills and perspectives that felt uniquely mine. 2 years after the family reunion that had seemed like such a devastating moment, I found myself preparing for another Thompson family gathering. This one was different. Mom and Dad were hosting Thanksgiving at their house in Riverside, and for the first time in my adult life, I was looking forward to sharing updates about my career and my life. Jessica was coming with news about her transition to nonprofit legal work. Tyler was bringing stories about his recent promotion to bank vice president. The cousins would share their updates about marriages, children, career changes, and life developments. But this time, I wasn't approaching the gathering with anxiety about proving myself or defending my choices. I was coming as someone who'd figured out how to build meaningful work around authentic interests, someone whose career path had led to recognition and financial stability and personal fulfillment. The night before leaving for Riverside, I sat in my Chicago apartment, reflecting on everything that had changed since that August afternoon when Jessica had called me the family disappointment. The external circumstances were dramatically different. I had a career I loved, financial security, professional recognition, and family relationships that felt supportive rather than judgmental. But the internal transformation was more significant. I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what constituted meaningful work. I'd discovered that being underestimated by people you love can be painful, but it doesn't have to define your possibilities. I'd realized that the most satisfying kind of success is the kind that feels authentically connected to who you actually are. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the best response to being called a disappointment isn't to argue or defend yourself in the moment. Sometimes it's to quietly go build the life that proves them wrong, not out of spite but out of self-respect and faith in your own potential. The Thanksgiving gathering was everything I'd hoped it would be. Jessica and I presented Mom and Dad with a framed copy of the Harvard Business Review article that featured our story about family members who'd both found courage to pursue more meaningful careers. The article had positioned us as examples of how siblings can influence each other toward greater authenticity and professional fulfillment, even through conflict and misunderstanding. During Dad's traditional toast about family achievements, he raised his glass and said something I'd never heard before. To Alex and Jessica, who taught us that there are many different ways to build successful lives, and that the most important kind of success is the kind that feels true to who you are. As I looked around the table at my family, I realized that being called the family disappointment had been one of the most valuable experiences of my life. Not because the label was accurate, but because it had forced me to stop seeking validation from people who couldn't see my potential, and start building the kind of work and life that felt authentically mine. The story wasn't really about proving anyone wrong, it was about proving myself right. Right to trust my instincts about what kind of work mattered to me. Right to believe that creative approaches could solve business problems. Right to think that meaningful work was worth pursuing even when the path seemed uncertain. Jessica had been wrong about me being the family disappointment, but she'd been accidentally right about something more important. I had needed to stop trying to fit into other people's definitions of success and start building success on my own terms. That journey had led me to everything I'd been looking for: work that challenged me intellectually and creatively, financial stability, professional recognition, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your daily efforts are connected to your authentic interests and values. Sometimes the people who underestimate you do you the biggest favor of your life. They force you to stop waiting for their approval and start building the life you actually want to live. 5 years had passed since that August afternoon when Jessica's words had shattered something inside me, only to reveal something stronger underneath. I stood at the podium of the Chicago Convention Center, looking out at 3,000 marketing professionals who had gathered for the annual Brand Innovation Summit, preparing to deliver the keynote speech that would officially launch my new book, Emotional Architecture: Building Authentic Connections in a Disconnected World. The journey from family disappointment to industry thought leader felt surreal, but every step had been earned through late nights, difficult conversations, failed experiments, and the kind of persistent faith in my own vision that I'd never possessed before. Walking out of that reunion 5 years earlier, Creative Consulting Solutions had grown from a mid-sized Chicago firm to a national consultancy with offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Austin. The emotional architecture methodology we'd pioneered with Madison Wells had become the gold standard for brands trying to build meaningful relationships with younger consumers. Harvard Business School had developed a case study around our approach. Marketing graduate programs assigned our published research as required reading. But the success that meant the most to me wasn't measured in revenue or recognition. It was the nonprofit division we'd built, which had helped over 200 mission-driven organizations transform their communications and fundraising strategies. It was the mentorship program I'd started for young creatives who felt lost in traditional corporate environments. It was the scholarship fund Jessica and I had established together for first-generation college students pursuing careers in creative industries. The personal transformation had been just as dramatic. I'd married Sam Martinez, a social worker I'd met through our nonprofit consulting work, someone who understood the importance of meaningful career choices and supported my commitment to work that felt authentic. We'd bought a house in Lincoln Park with enough space for the design studio I'd always dreamed of having, where I could work on personal projects that had no client expectations or profit requirements. Jessica had thrived in her transition to public interest law. She'd become the executive director of the Ohio Justice Coalition, leading statewide criminal justice reform initiatives and building the kind of legal career that felt aligned with her values. The sister who had once dismissed my creative ambitions now regularly sought my advice on communication strategy for her advocacy campaigns. Our parents had both retired, spending their time traveling to places they'd always planned to visit someday and volunteering for causes they cared about. Dad had become involved with a veterans organization, using his business experience to help other retired military personnel transition to civilian careers. Mom had started tutoring adult literacy students, inspired by the work I'd done with Aunt Caroline's foundation years earlier. The Thompson family gatherings had become something I looked forward to rather than endured. We'd developed new traditions around supporting each other's career transitions and celebrating unconventional achievements. When Tyler left banking to start a food truck business, the family rallied around him with the same enthusiasm they'd once reserved for traditional professional milestones. When cousin Megan decided to pursue graduate school in environmental science at 35, no one questioned whether it was a practical decision. But it was the message I'd received 3 weeks earlier that had prompted the deepest reflection on how far I'd traveled from that devastating afternoon 5 years ago. The LinkedIn message had come from someone I'd never heard of, a 26-year-old graphic designer in Portland named River Chen. "Alex, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly, but I wanted you to know that your story probably saved my career and maybe my life. I heard your podcast interview about being called the family disappointment and choosing to build success on your own terms instead of seeking validation from people who couldn't see your potential. When you talked about that moment of deciding to trust yourself even when everyone around you thought you were making a mistake, it gave me permission to make a decision I'd been afraid to make for 2 years." River had gone on to explain their situation. A talented designer stuck in a corporate marketing job that paid well but felt meaningless, facing family pressure to stay in a stable position rather than pursue freelance creative work that excited them. The pressure had been intensifying as they approached their late 20s without the traditional markers of success their family expected. "Your story helped me understand that seeking approval from people who don't understand your vision is a trap that keeps you small. 3 months ago, I quit my corporate job and started freelancing full-time. Last week I landed my dream client, a sustainable fashion brand that's trying to change how consumers think about clothing consumption. The work is challenging, financially unstable, and exactly what I want to be doing with my life. I don't know if I would have had the courage to make that leap without hearing how you navigated a similar situation." The message had reminded me of something I'd forgotten in the midst of professional success and family reconciliation. The most important impact of my story wasn't the business achievements or industry recognition. It was the possibility that sharing my experience might help other people find courage to trust themselves when everyone around them was suggesting they should be practical, safe, conventional. That realization had led to the book, which had become a bestseller not because it offered easy answers about career success, but because it validated the experience of feeling underestimated and provided a framework for building authentic professional lives despite external pressure to conform. As I looked out at the conference audience, I could see younger faces mixed in with the senior marketing executives and established consultants. People who looked like they might be struggling with the same questions I'd wrestled with years earlier. People who might be serving coffee while building creative portfolios in their spare time, or working corporate jobs while dreaming of starting their own businesses, or facing family skepticism about career choices that didn't fit traditional definitions of success. 5 years ago, my sister stood up at a family gathering and announced to everyone present that I was the family disappointment. She wasn't trying to be cruel, she was expressing what most of them had been thinking for years. I was 28 years old, living in a tiny apartment, working odd jobs, chasing what looked like unrealistic dreams in a creative industry that had no guarantees. The audience was completely quiet, and I could see people leaning forward with interest. This wasn't the typical keynote opening they'd expected. From her perspective, and from the perspective of most of my family, I was wasting my potential by refusing to pursue stable conventional career paths. I was choosing uncertainty over security, creative fulfillment over financial responsibility, personal meaning over social approval. And in many ways they were right about the risks I was taking. I clicked to the first slide, which showed a photo of my small apartment in Riverside, the desk by the window where I'd worked on freelance projects late into the night. But what they couldn't see was that every project I worked on, every client I helped, every late night I spent perfecting work that no one had asked me to improve, was building towards something larger. I was developing a methodology for creating emotional connections between brands and consumers that would eventually transform how major companies approach customer relationships. The next slide showed the Madison Wells campaign results, the Harvard Business Review article, the list of clients who had adopted emotional architecture principles. I'm not telling you this story to suggest that following your creative instincts guarantees professional success. I'm sharing it because I want you to understand that being underestimated by people you love, while painful, can also be liberating. It can free you from the exhausting work of trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided what your potential looks like. I saw several people in the audience nodding, and I could feel the energy in the room shifting towards something more personal than a typical business presentation. The most important lesson I learned from being called the family disappointment wasn't about career strategy or creative methodology, it was about the difference between seeking validation and building value. When you're focused on getting other people to recognize your worth, you're constantly performing for an audience that might not understand what you're trying to accomplish. But when you focus on building genuine value through work that feels authentic to your interests and capabilities, recognition becomes a byproduct rather than the primary goal. I shared the story of River Chen and the dozens of other messages I'd received from young professionals who felt trapped between family expectations and personal aspirations. Each story had common elements: talented people who were afraid to trust their instincts, families who meant well but couldn't see beyond traditional success metrics, and the internal struggle between safety and authenticity. The emotional architecture approach we've developed at Creative Consulting Solutions isn't just about marketing strategy, it's about understanding that every person, whether they're a consumer making purchasing decisions or a creative professional making career choices, is trying to build a life that feels aligned with their deepest values and aspirations. The brands that succeed are the ones that help people become who they want to be. The careers that feel sustainable are the ones that let you use your authentic capabilities in service of goals you actually care about. I clicked to a slide showing some of the nonprofit organizations we'd worked with over the past 5 years. Literacy programs, environmental advocacy groups, social justice organizations, community development initiatives. One of the most rewarding aspects of our work has been helping mission-driven organizations apply these principles to their communications and
fundraising efforts. When you understand what motivates people at an emotional level, you can help them see how supporting your cause connects to their personal values and identity goals. But the same principle applies to career decisions. When you understand what motivates you at an emotional level, you can make choices that feel aligned with your authentic self rather than performing for external approval. I spent the next 20 minutes walking through specific examples of how emotional architecture principles could be applied to personal brand development, career transition strategies, and building professional relationships that felt genuine rather than transactional. But the heart of the presentation was the framework I'd developed for making decisions when external pressure conflicts with internal instincts. The same process I'd used when deciding to leave Riverside for Chicago, when choosing to turn down safer opportunities in favor of more meaningful work, when building a consulting practice around methods that hadn't been proven in traditional business contexts. The framework has 4 components, I explained, showing the slide I'd presented at dozens of conferences over the past 2 years. First, clarity about your actual interests and capabilities, not the ones other people think you should have. Second, research into whether those interests and capabilities can solve real problems for people willing to pay for solutions. Third, experimentation with small projects that let you test your assumptions without risking everything. And fourth, patience with the process of building expertise and reputation in areas where you have authentic advantages. The audience was taking notes now, and I could see people photographing slides and sharing the content in real time on social media. This framework guided every major decision I made during the transition from family disappointment to industry consultant. It's also the framework I share with young creatives who participate in our mentorship program, and it's the foundation of the career transition workshops. My sister Jessica now runs for lawyers who want to move into public interest work.
I told them about the scholarship program Jessica and I had created, and about the evening classes we taught together for first-generation college students who were trying to navigate career decisions without family members who understood professional creative industries. The most rewarding part of this work isn't the business success or the industry recognition. It's the messages I receive from people who decided to trust themselves despite external pressure to be practical. People who discovered that their version of meaningful work was possible, even when it didn't look like anyone else's definition of career success. As I prepared to wrap up the presentation, I clicked to a final slide that showed a photo from the most recent Thompson family Thanksgiving. Jessica and I were in the kitchen, laughing about something while we prepared vegetables. Our parents were in the background, talking to Tyler about his food truck expansion plans. The image captured something that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier, a family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than performance of predetermined roles. I want to leave you with the most important insight from my experience of being underestimated and then proving those expectations wrong. The goal isn't to show people they were mistaken about your potential, though that might happen as a pleasant side effect. The goal is to build work and relationships that feel authentic to who you actually are, regardless of whether other people initially understand or approve of your choices. I paused, looking out at the audience, thinking about 28-year-old Alex who had walked out of that family reunion feeling devastated and uncertain about the future. Being called the family disappointment was one of the most valuable experiences of my life. Not because the assessment was accurate, but because it forced me to stop seeking validation from people who couldn't see my potential and start building the kind of work and life that felt genuinely mine. Sometimes the people who underestimate you do you the biggest favor possible. They free you from the exhausting work of trying to fit into their expectations and give you permission to discover what you're actually capable of accomplishing. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but the real reward came afterward, during the book signing, when person after person approached to share their own stories of feeling underestimated and finding courage to pursue work that felt meaningful. A 25-year-old teacher who wanted to start an educational nonprofit. A 32-year-old accountant who was building a photography business on weekends. A recent graduate whose parents wanted her to go to law school but who was passionate about sustainable agriculture. Each conversation reminded me of why I'd written the book and why sharing this story felt important. Not because my path was the right one for everyone, but because the principles of trusting yourself, building genuine value, and maintaining authentic relationships could be applied to any situation where external expectations conflicted with internal instincts. That evening, I called Jessica from my hotel room to tell her about the presentation and the audience response. "Alex, I'm so proud of what you've built. Not just the business success, but the way you've used your platform to help other people find courage to trust themselves. I couldn't have done any of this without you calling me the family disappointment," I said, and we both laughed. "I can't believe you're still thanking me for that." "I'm serious, Jess. That moment forced me to stop waiting for family approval and start building the life I actually wanted. It was the push I needed to trust myself even when it felt risky." "Well, in that case, you're welcome, but I'm also sorry it took me so long to understand that there are many different ways to build meaningful careers. Speaking of which, how's the criminal justice reform campaign going?" Jessica spent the next 20 minutes updating me on legislative initiatives, coalition-building efforts, and media strategy for their current advocacy campaign. As she talked, I marveled at how passionate and articulate she sounded when discussing work that felt aligned with her values, compared to how she used to sound when talking about corporate legal cases. "Jess, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you ever regret the time you spent in corporate law? Do you feel like those 10 years were wasted because they weren't leading toward the work you're doing now?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "You know, I used to feel that way, like I'd spent a decade building expertise in areas that didn't matter to me. but I've realized that everything I learned about legal research, case strategy, negotiation, and client management has made me more effective in advocacy work. The skills transferred, even when the values didn't. That's a generous way to look at it. It's also realistic. I don't think I could have jumped directly from law school into executive director of a statewide coalition. I needed to build credibility and expertise first, even if I was building them in contexts that didn't feel personally meaningful at the time. Her words reminded me of something I'd learned about career transitions through our consulting work. Most people who successfully moved from conventional careers to meaningful work didn't discard everything they'd learned in their previous roles. They found ways to apply established skills and relationships to new purposes that felt more aligned with their values. That's actually a great point for the next version of the Career Transition Workshop. The skills you develop in unsatisfying work aren't wasted if you can apply them to work that feels more meaningful. Exactly. And Alex, I think that's true for your experience too. All those years of feeling like the family disappointment, of having to justify your choices and defend your vision, taught you how to communicate creative ideas to skeptical audiences. That's probably part of why you're so good at helping corporate executives understand emotional architecture concepts. I hadn't thought about it that way before, but she was right. Years of explaining my career decisions to family members who didn't understand creative industries had prepared me for the challenge of translating innovative marketing strategies into language that conservative business leaders could embrace. You know what's funny? I said. I spent so many years wishing the family would understand and support my work from the beginning. But if they had, I might not have developed the communication skills and resilience that have been essential to building this business. Maybe being underestimated was exactly the preparation you needed for the career you ended up building. After we hung up, I sat in my hotel room, looking out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about the circular nature of growth and learning. The qualities that had made me seem like a disappointment to my family, persistence in the face of skepticism, willingness to pursue uncertain paths, commitment to work that felt meaningful rather than just profitable, had turned out to be exactly the qualities I needed to succeed in creative consulting. The experience of being dismissed and underestimated had taught me to trust my instincts even when external validation was absent. The years of financial uncertainty had taught me to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than just the recognition or compensation it provided. The isolation of pursuing an unconventional path had taught me to build supportive relationships with people who shared similar values and aspirations. None of those lessons would have been learned if my family had immediately understood and supported my creative ambitions. The struggle had been essential preparation for the success that followed. 3 months later, I received another LinkedIn message that brought the full circle nature of this journey into sharp focus. It was from a marketing executive at a Fortune 500 company who had attended the Brand Innovation Summit keynote. Alex, your presentation about being underestimated and building authentic success resonated with me in unexpected ways. I've spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder in traditional marketing roles, achieving everything I thought I wanted professionally, but your talk made me realize that I've been performing success rather than building it around my actual interests and capabilities. The message went on to describe his situation: a successful career that felt empty, family pressure to maintain a lifestyle that required high income, and a growing sense that he was wasting his potential by staying in roles that didn't challenge him creatively. I wanted you to know that I've decided to join your team at Creative Consulting Solutions. I know it means taking a step back in title and compensation, but after hearing your story, I understand that those external markers of success don't matter if the work itself doesn't feel meaningful. I'm excited to learn the emotional architecture approach and contribute to the kind of innovative thinking your firm is known for. The irony was perfect. Someone who had achieved everything the Thompson family had once wanted for me, someone with the impressive title and substantial salary that Jessica had thought I should pursue, was choosing to leave that conventional success behind to join the unconventional path I'd been building. I immediately called Dr. Bennett to discuss bringing him onto our team. His corporate experience and established relationships could help us expand into industry sectors we hadn't yet penetrated, while our methodology and culture could give him the creative fulfillment he was seeking. This is exactly the kind of career transition our firm is designed to support, Dr. Bennett said, after I explained the situation. Someone with strong traditional business skills who wants to apply those capabilities to more innovative and meaningful work. He'll bring credibility with conservative corporate clients and will give him the creative challenges he's been missing. That conversation led to a realization that would shape the next phase of creative consulting solutions growth. We weren't just a marketing consultancy anymore, we were a destination for talented professionals who wanted to do meaningful creative work without sacrificing business sophistication. Our team had become a collection of people who had chosen authentic career paths over conventional ones, and that shared commitment to meaningful work was making us more effective with clients who were trying to build more authentic relationships with their customers. 6 months later, we launched the Professional Transition Initiative, a formal program for helping established business professionals move into creative consulting roles. The program included career assessment, skills development, mentorship matching, and project-based learning opportunities that let people test their interest in emotional architecture work before making dramatic career changes. The response was overwhelming. Within 3 months, we had a waiting list of over 200 professionals who wanted to transition from traditional corporate roles to creative consulting work. Marketing executives, brand managers, research analysts, account directors, all looking for ways to apply their business experience to work that felt more personally meaningful. But the program also attracted people from completely different industries. A physician who wanted to use behavioral psychology insights to improve healthcare communications. A teacher who was interested in applying educational theory to corporate training programs. A social worker who understood community engagement dynamics and wanted to help brands build more authentic relationships with underserved demographics. Each person brought unique perspectives and capabilities that enriched our collective ability to solve complex client challenges. The diversity of backgrounds and experiences on our team was becoming one of our primary competitive advantages. As I reflected on the journey from family disappointment to industry leader, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been external recognition or financial success. It had been learning to trust my instincts about what kind of work felt authentic and sustainable, and building a professional community around people who shared that commitment to meaningful career choices. The family reunion, where Jessica had called me the disappointment, now seemed like the beginning of everything good that had followed. Not because her assessment had been wrong, though it had been, but because her words had forced me to stop seeking validation from people who couldn't see my potential and start building value for people who could recognize and appreciate innovative thinking. Sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives turn out to be the most necessary ones. Sometimes being underestimated becomes the catalyst for discovering what you're actually capable of accomplishing. Sometimes the people who dismiss your dreams do you the biggest favor possible by freeing you from the need to fit into their expectations. 5 years later, I was no longer the Thompson family disappointment, but more importantly, I was no longer someone who needed family approval to feel confident about my career choices. I had built work that felt authentic, relationships that felt supportive, and a professional identity that was genuinely mine rather than a performance of what other people thought success should look like. The story that had started with humiliation and uncertainty had become a foundation for helping other people find courage to trust themselves when everyone around them was suggesting they should be practical. And that transformation from personal pain to collective purpose felt like the most meaningful success of all. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing applications for our latest scholarship recipients. It was Mom, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Alex, you need to sit down for this." "What's going on?" "Your father just got off the phone with the mayor's office. They want to name the new community business incubator after you. The Alex Thompson Center for Creative Enterprise. They're saying your story has inspired so many young entrepreneurs in Riverside that they want to create a permanent space where people can pursue unconventional business ideas with proper support. I sat back in my chair stunned. Riverside, Ohio, the town where I'd been considered the family disappointment, wanted to name a building after me. Mom, that's incredible, but are you sure? I mean, 5 years ago, most people there thought I was wasting my life. That's exactly why this matters, sweetheart. The mayor said your journey from local ? To national success has shown young people that they don't have to leave Riverside to pursue meaningful careers. They can build something meaningful right here. The irony was beautiful. The same community that had once made me feel like an outsider now wanted to celebrate the path that had taken me away from conventional expectations. There's more, Mom continued. They want you to speak at the dedication ceremony, and they're asking if you'd consider establishing a satellite office there. A place where creative professionals could live in a smaller community while working on national projects. The idea sparked something immediate and exciting. Sam and I had been talking about wanting to spend more time closer to family, especially as we considered starting our own family. A creative consulting solutions outpost in Riverside could serve clients remotely while providing the kind of work-life balance that felt impossible in Chicago. Tell the mayor I'm honored, and I'd love to discuss the possibilities. After hanging up, I walked to the window of my Chicago office, looking out at the skyline that had become so familiar. 5 years ago, this city had represented everything I hoped to achieve professionally. Now it felt like one chapter in a larger story that was still being written. The real success wasn't the awards or recognition, or even the financial security, it was the knowledge that being called the family disappointment had led me to discover what I was actually capable of creating. The humiliation had become the foundation for everything meaningful that followed. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be exactly what you needed to become, who you were meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.